Hey, everybody. I am back from a mini sabbatical, back from Australia, where I am still jet lagged. And I'm very, very excited about the guest today, Mathew Polly. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did, Polly.
Beautiful. And I'm particularly excited because the subject of this, if you don't know, is Mathew just launched the book Bruce Lee: A Life, and it's getting insane reviews. And the reason I wanted to get him on the show is in many ways, Bruce Lee was a spiritual teacher to me when I was 13, 14, 15. Bruce passed away in 73. I was 13 in 73. And I remember just being infatuated by his drive, his life, his method, his message. And I remember sitting on the floor looking at Bruce Lee magazines, and my mom comes over, and we had, family business, the garment industry, and, manufacturing, import. And my mom says to me, "Dear, have you thought about what you're going to be when you're older? You're going to be a lawyer? You're going to be a doctor? You're going to go into the family business?" And I looked up from the magazine. I was stretching on the floor, and I said, "No, Mom, I'm going to be a martial artist like Bruce Lee and develop my own self-defense system." And she pat me on the head and say, "Okay, dear, we'll talk about this when you're older." And so in many ways, and I knew something. And so, holding this book in my hand, I can't wait to dig. I flipped through it. I skimmed through it. It was just given to me by my good friend, Dave Castro, just before I took off to Australia. And I could not get through it. But I've been flipping through it and reading reviews online, and I'm excited to have you on here because I think this is going to be maybe a different interview than maybe the scores of others that you've done. But welcome to the show, man.
Great to be on. Thanks so much for having me on, Tony.
So let's start with you, and I'm assuming in other interviews people are talking about, tell us, the real gossip, the real rumor. Tell us, how Bruce really died, and what's I want to talk about you. I want to talk about your background, because I've been trying to write a book or complete a book for 30 years. So, and I get messages all the time. When's your book coming out? When's your book? I'm going soon. It's like, so that's epic. First of all, congratulations on writing a book. That's epic. It's not even a small book, so on a massive book. And then there are so many books on Bruce Lee out there. So what compelled you to, it's like if there was like one or two biographies, you can go, I'm going to do another one. But there's so many. What compelled you to take this on?
So my story is a bit similar to yours. When I was a skinny, bullied 12-year-old, I first saw Enter the Dragon. I had no idea who Bruce Lee was. I'd never seen a kung fu movie, and he jumped off the screen into my imagination. I bought a pair of nunchucks, trapped myself in the skull repeatedly, and then took up the martial arts, and eventually dropped out of college, went to the Shaolin Temple in China, and spent 2 years with the Shaolin monks studying Kung Fu. And that book, that experience became my first book, American Shaolin, which sort of launched my martial arts writing career. And then I did a book on mixed martial arts, where I trained with guys like Randy Couture, George St. Pierre. And then when I finished that, my wife said to me, the next project, you have to pick one where you don't get punched in the face. And someone mentioned Bruce Lee, and I had the same reaction you did, which is, there are dozens and dozens of books about him out there. He's been written about for 40 years. Why would I want to write another Bruce Lee book? And then I did some basic research and found out the last biography written was 25 years ago. And it was pretty thin and not very well researched. And I was sort of insulted that Bruce Lee didn't have a proper biography.
Nice.
The Queen has half a dozen. Bruce Lee doesn't have one. And so I felt like because I've written for major publishers, I could do something that would break him into the mainstream instead of just the martial arts press.
Nice. How long did it take you from that day to completion? Was it like a week or two, 3 weeks?
Yeah. I rolled over and I knocked it out. The contract was for 18 months. And so 7 years later, you have that book in front of you. So
Wow.
that's basically, the research took about 3 years, and then it took about 3+ years to turn all of the research into an actual book.
Nice. So impressive, man. I can't wait to dig in. Like I said, the feedback online, and I consider myself a Bruce Lee junkie and a bit of a Bruce Lee historian. So I'm very interested in like the research, the contrast between, and I remember reading in all the books about Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch and 3-inch punch. And here I am, this 15, 16, 17-year-old infatuated going, how did this I was 168 pounds, like junior middleweight, I was boxing, kickboxing and training every day. And I'm going, how did this 140 pound, 145 pound man generate this force that in the books it said knock people like 10 feet across the room, knock this guy into the, and then years later, I was over at Paul Vunak's house in the mid 90s or 80s. I don't even remember. It's like 4 decades that I've been teaching now. It's crazy. Yeah. That blows my mind in itself. But and he showed me a VHS video of Bruce doing 1 and 3-inch punches, and it was something that Dan Inosanto had given him and hadn't been out. I think these are out online now. But when I looked at it, it was the first time I'd seen it in decades where it wasn't 10 feet and it wasn't 1 inch and it wasn't, and as amazing as Bruce was, it was like, holy shit. Okay. I see what's happening. And it was almost a Roger Bannister effect for me, where I had been visualizing something that he didn't do. And it made me develop a skill set that was beyond what I would have done. Right. And then when I saw it, I was like, holy shit. So all of that to say, I'm excited to discover things that I thought were truths that are untruth. And is there one or two that blew your mind when holy shit, like you interviewed this person and this had been the rumor or the thought all along? Were there a couple that jumped out at you?
One of the biggest experiences was I stayed 6 months in Hong Kong. And interviewed people, but part of that time I spent in the Hong Kong Film Archives and watched nearly 20 of his Cantonese films.
Okay.
And what blew my mind is not a single one of them were kung fu. He was like the Macaulay Culkin of Hong Kong. And so when you watch them one after another, and they're melodramas, they're weepies, he plays orphans, he does comedies, what you realize is he was an actor long before he got into martial arts. And what made him special is he merged two passions, his acting and his love for martial arts, and became a martial arts actor. And that's why I think he's unique to, say, someone like Chuck Norris, who was really a martial artist his whole life and then got into acting. But right. Bruce was both. And that's why I think he can do things on screen. I watched Chuck Liddell, who's a fantastic fighter, try to make it in the movies, and he just doesn't have the ability to convey the martial arts on screen. It's a totally different skill. And that to me was the biggest sort of revelation. I was like, oh, he's an actor. I know actors. I know right. They're like, a little bit self-centered. They're always on show. They're performers. And even when he got to the States and was only teaching martial arts, his favorite thing was to go on the road and give performances. He wasn't like a martial arts competitor like, say, Joe Louis. He was a martial arts performer from the very beginning. His favorite thing to do, not that he wasn't a very good fighter, but right. His favorite thing to do was to get up on stage and show off. That's fascinating and true. And you can see that in almost everybody else who tried to post Bruce era, tried to make it in the movies, and what they had were good abs and flexibility, but they couldn't sell a punch, and and it's almost like what people don't realize. I've done a few movies from the stunt side, right. and stuntmen they're movement actors. They're selling the violence, or they're selling the hit, right. or selling people don't realize that. And that's a neat observation, because there was a reason, that he was so
his energy was so contagious. And I think that if we had taken away all those years of him acting, he just would have been another guy who was ripped, 147 pounds and ripped. And there's lots of guys out there, but we're not mesmerized when they're on screen.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Did any other little, I saw something online about his heritage, which was, which is, how did you discover that? And it was so amazing. I posted that and some guy made some, off color comment about that. And I said, what are you, anti-Semitic? And he goes, no, not at all. And he had a Jewish name. And it was like, I was like, this is just fun. Let's just enjoy these little known facts. But how did that come about?
So for 4 decades, people believed that everyone knew he was part Eurasian. And the story was that his grandfather was a German Catholic priest who had knocked up a Chinese girl.
Okay.
So he was a quarter German Catholic. And that turns out to be completely untrue. I think it's a family story because even the siblings believed it.
Okay.
But I was doing some deep dive into Google search, got on some obscure website and discovered who his great uncle was, who was Sir Robert Hotong, who was the richest man in Hong Kong.
Okay.
And then I went from there and discovered Sir Robert Hotong's father, which would be Bruce Lee's grandfather, was actually a Dutch Jewish son of a kosher butcher. He was born in Rotterdam and came over to Hong Kong and bought himself a Chinese concubine. And that's how his mother's side of the family formed. And the Jewish part is like, it's a quirky detail. It's fun. I don't think it means anything other than the fact that his sons became extremely wealthy, and that influenced Bruce, I think, in very specific ways, because when he came to America, he didn't think of himself as inferior. He grew up thinking of himself as like a member of the elite.
Right.
And having that kind of confidence was crucial to his success in Hollywood because he believed he should be as big a star as Steve McQueen. And that's not something you would get if you were the son of a couple peasants in southern China. You had to have had a decent education, a proper upbringing, and the kind of things that Bruce had that were necessary for his success.
Fascinating. It's true. Yeah. The subtext and all that. It's just, it's in our courses, we talk about the difference between subject matter expert and substance matters, and the substance being like what's underneath the story or the image. And most people don't get to the substance part. Did doing all this work enhance your feelings for Bruce, or did it demystify stuff? How's that?
It did both, which is interesting. Certain things were demystified, but by being demystified, he actually became more impressive.
Okay.
When I was growing up, I did the same thing. I watched the movies, and then I read the magazines, and then I watched Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and he was sort of this superhuman character, invincible. And so what he achieved by becoming the first Chinese American male actor to ever star in a Hollywood movie seemed like inevitable. Like he was just so amazing that, of course, everything he did. But when you start off and find out he almost died of cholera as a young boy, he was skinny, scrawny, he had one leg shorter than the other, he was nearsighted, he was a terrible student, he basically got kicked out of Hong Kong and sent to America. You realize how sort of impossible the odds were that he could achieve what he did, and therefore his accomplishments are more incredible to me.
Yeah, it is amazing. I've read all those stories in that background and stuff like that, and it was kind of a crazy thing. And I mentioned this just as we logged on. I was just consumed and infatuated with the stuff. And then I think it was in 85, I was, where I lived in Montreal, there was a kind of like a bustling, film type industry. And I was doing stunt work there. And I remember, deciding I should learn a little bit more about acting. And I picked up this book by Eric Morris called Irreverent Acting. And I was going out to LA to do an interview for Inside Karate or Inside Kung Fu magazine. And so I looked at the back of the book and I said, hey, there was a phone number to contact them. And so I called and I said, hey, you know, how much for private lessons? He said, I don't really do them. And we started talking, and he happened to have been coach to Chuck Norris. And also, do you remember Jim Cata, the movie when with the guy with the Olympian, I forget who his name, you know, he was his guy. And he happens to mention, he says, and Brandon Lee's a student of mine. And I'm like, that's so trippy. And he goes, but how did you get my number? And I go, it's in the back of the book. I just picked it up at our version of Barnes and Noble's back then.
Right.
You know? He goes, yeah, but he said, the book's not out yet. I said, well, I'm holding it. What do you mean it's not out? He says, that's weird. You got it in Canada? I said, yeah. So we ended up going out there, and I'm kind of freaking out a little bit here going, I might meet Brandon Lee. This is really weird. Because as a, you know, I mean, you went through this, so we can, you know, relate to this. Is like there's no way to meet Bruce Lee, right? Right. And it was just this whole thing of like, oh my God, you know, Bruce Lee, like, you know, and so I'm out there, and we're watching a monologue, and there's a bunch of actors, typical like movie scene, like in some weird creepy building with a bunch of people who look like freaks and, you know, wearing weird clothes, or, you know, and it's the like you said, you know, actors, they're different, right? And I'm in there like, and I'm sitting there, and there's and Brandon comes in, and the place is full, and he ends up literally sitting beside me on the floor. I'm like, my heart's pounding. I'm like, oh my God, like, just, and I don't know why. I mean, you know, it's Brandon Lee, right? And the guy doing the monologue was really good in acting this insane character where he's either going to kill himself or kill people in some weird scene from whatever, you know, play. And he pulls out a real knife out of his pocket and starts playing with it during the set, during the monologue. And he pulls it out, and everyone's like looking, and we're like maybe 6-7 feet away from him, but he had crazy eyes, Matt. And it was like, and both Brandon and I shifted our stances. Like we were on the floor, and we both kind of like shifted a little bit because it was kind of dark and creepy. And like, what if this guy does?
Right.
But we both shifted to advantageous positions to move simultaneously. And that's when he noticed me, and I really noticed him, because it was almost like we were in stereo getting ready to, you know, like defend people or intercept this. And we ended up talking a little bit. And then after, he said, hey, we're going to go over to, you know, Cantor's Deli and a bunch of the actors, and we're walking. And that began a friendship that lasted years and years and years, from training to him coming to, you know, hang out with me in Montreal. I went to Hong Kong for quite some time to work on Legacy of Rage, and I was actually on the set of The Crow a couple of days before the accident. So pretty freaky. It was excited to talk to you, you know, because there's like a deeper connection to me,
right?
Like with this. And I remember when the premiere of Legacy of Rage happened, Linda flew to Hong Kong, and I went to the airport with Brandon to pick her up. And it was that, you know, that famous black and white scene where Brandon's meeting Coburn, you know, like in the airport, and I think it was Coburn. And I was like, all of a sudden, this was like fucking surreal. I'm looking at this, and I grab, I'm helping with the bags, and we're walking to the hotel, and I'm thinking like Linda's like immaculately dressed, and she can tell that she's, you know, she's done okay. And but she's got this one suitcase that I'm carrying that is like this piece of shit. It's like this old, like tartan, you know, like, you know, canvas. And I'm like thinking, wow, like she's got this cool suitcase here and she's got this Louis Vuitton, this or that, whatever it is. And I'm looking down going, why does she have this old shitty suitcase? And I look down and the initials BL are on it. And I just got insane goosebumps now, just reliving that was 1986.
Right.
And I'm going, oh my God, like she kept this because it was Bruce's. Holy shit. Right.
Right.
So, did you get to, sorry for my rant there, back to, it was very heavy for me. Did you speak to immediate family and what was their feeling about the book and some of your questions and stuff?
I did. I spoke to Linda and Shannon and Phoebe, his sister. I interchanged with Robert, but I didn't get a chance to interview him. The book, I think they've had bad experiences with biographies in the past.
For sure.
And so, and for a long time, there hasn't been a proper biography. So that's meant the estate has sort of had control over his image. So this is an independent book. So I think they were a little cautious around me. But when I interviewed Shannon, Bruce died when she was 4. So her memories of him were very, impressionistic.
Right.
But of course she remembers her brother Brandon very well. And at the end of the book, I thought it was important to tell what happened after Bruce died, sort of his impact on the world, but also his impact on his family. And so the section I wrote about Brandon was very much based on sort of Shannon's recollections of her brother, which are very fond of, as you would imagine. And I actually, it's interesting when I would talk to people who were friends with Bruce Lee and I would get to his death, a lot of them would choke up. And Van Williams, who played the Green Hornet,
right,
crying on the phone.
Wow.
But I think it's a generational thing. For me, writing about Brandon was the hardest part because I was old enough to remember his death and watch The Crow and think about, what that meant. Whereas, Bruce's was a stage right before me. So
right.
I think for me, at least, Brandon's was the hardest because I felt like his life was just starting to happen. And Bruce, even though he also died very young at the age of 32, he accomplished a lot of what he wanted. He had a wife, he had kids, he made a bunch of movies, and he finally got to be a bigger star than Steve McQueen, which
right.
At the end of his life was this great thing. So in a weird way, even though Bruce's life was short, I don't feel like it was tragic that it ended early.
Right. In terms of his, what he aspired to.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. The Brandon thing was crazy. On the, it was, we were close. He came to Montreal once. We went out for sushi and drinking sake, and it was a place I was a regular with, and I would never introduce him as
sure
Brandon Lee or Bruce Lee's son, and the sushi chef is serving us, and we're drinking sake and having fun, and all of a sudden he pauses and he goes, and his mannerisms, like if you knew Bruce, like genetic code. There were some when Brandon would laugh or make a certain face, you'd go, holy shit, that's Bruce Lee, right? And so we're there and laughing and everything else, and the sushi chef pauses and he goes, anyone ever tell you look like Bruce Lee? And and we started laughing, and we never told him. I told him after he left. Right. We didn't want media or him telling friends or shit like that. But
sure.
But it was an amazing time, and like I said, I went to visit him on the Crow, and being around stunts and being around stuff, and I'm watching them block out scenes, and it was one of these things where, like, when I got the call a couple of days later, because it was literally like 3 days later, and it was, I don't even think I've ever processed it. You know,
Mm.
it was one of those things where I just went like, okay, next. Like I didn't even want to deeply think about it. It was mind boggling. He was a really interesting, super smart, super smart guy,
Yep.
fun, free spirit, really good athlete. Um, anyways, but, that kind of,
It's terrible. Yeah. It's a
yeah.
terrible. That was the hardest part to write. I felt his death was the hardest part to write.
Yeah. The let's try and pick this interview up. Or it's like, okay, let's wrap it right now. That was the let's did in terms of his training, some of the legendary fights and stuff like that. Were anything there where we go, that didn't really happen, or this is, you know?
Sure. So one thing was the story of him boxing. He has a boxing match as a teenager against an English boy when he was like 17, and there's like 10 different versions of that story, and 8 of them involve him knocking the guy out in 10 seconds.
Right.
And so I got to a couple of people who were actually there and competed, and were like, you know, Bruce won, but his Wing Chun punches inside boxing gloves didn't have much power. And
Right.
so he would kind of crash into him and knock him down, and then the boy would jump back up. And it lasted 3 rounds, went to a decision, and it was given to Bruce. What's interesting is that Bruce was really upset because anything less than perfect for him was not good enough. And so throughout his life, like with the fight with Wong Jack Man, where he wins as well, but it takes 3 minutes and it's a big mess, Bruce was frustrated, and that caused his break with Wing Chun. I think one of the most interesting stories that made me feel like I understood Bruce was he was in a challenge match. They used to fight on the rooftops in Hong Kong, and the Wing Chun guys were really big into these challenge matches. And so Bruce had studied for maybe 2 years. He started when he was about 16, not 13, as a lot of people tend to say in the books. So he didn't have much experience, 2 years, but he was a fast learner and he was pretty good. He gets on the rooftop. They're going to fight 2 rounds. His teacher is Wang Shunlong, who is one of the senior instructors under Yip Man. And Wang Shunlong is in his corner, and Bruce fights the first round and loses. Like, he gets punched in the eye. He gets you can feel a black eye coming on. And between the first and second round, Bruce turns to his cornerman, his teacher, Wang Shunlong, and says, "Hey, let's just quit here and call this one a tie."
Right.
And Wang Shunlong looks at 17-year-old Bruce Lee and says, "How's it a tie? You lost the first round. If you forfeit now, you lose." And Bruce is like, "Well, my dad is going to find out I was fighting, and I'm going to get into trouble." And Wang Shunlong has to cajole him into going into the second round. He calms him down. Bruce wins the second round decisively. The fight's over, and he wins the fight. And afterwards, Ip Man pulls Wang Shunlong aside and says, "If Bruce Lee ever accomplishes anything in the martial arts, it's because you made sure he didn't quit. He worked through his fear and stuck with it." But for me, having been in a few, challenge fights and in the ring, I know what that fear is between round 1 and round 2.
Right.
And so Bruce Lee of the image has no fear, but Bruce Lee, the human being, of course, was afraid. And, when you're afraid, you want to try to get out of something. And it took his teacher to essentially cajole him into fighting that second round. And so I think that was one of the major turning points in Bruce's life.
It's serendipitous that you, of course, bring up fear, because that's the theme of my life's work, and you're right. You're in the middle of something, and then you get this unsolicited movie playing in your head that says, in Bruce's case, "Oh, my dad is going to be upset," as opposed to what's really going on. And it's hard, especially at 17 and almost at any age, to develop the self-awareness where you go, okay, I'm, manifesting these different symbols to talk me out of doing something. But really what this is just my fear of failure.
Right.
And it goes on with everything, man. I'm 58 and got some big business changes coming up. And like my nervous system is like on edge, and it's impacting how I focus. But, the difference is, after decades and decades in business and life and lots of fights, and I don't mean like street fights for those people listening, life fights.
Mm-hmm.
I go, okay, this is exactly this, and I've got to work through it. I've got to, and everyone has that. I'm sure were there other things, and I want to draw this like to you personally. But let's hit one more with Bruce with fear. Were there other things that came up with respect to fear where you, of course, he's not around to interview and go, like, how did you do this? We know his story. And just so people understand, if in the back of Bruce's mind was, when he decided he was going to be bigger than Steve McQueen, he might have seen a Steve McQueen movie, not even met him at the time. And people who don't know, I mean, he was friends with Steve, but he might have set that as like, that's the standard. I will have made it. And so, when people ask like a type A personality, what drives you, what keeps you going, they might say something that sounds positive, but the substance under the subject of, I want to be bigger than Steve, is the fear of losing, the fear of not accomplishing that. And so that's why I always tell people, hey, fear is either this fuel that you use and you learn to look at it and use it to supercharge what you need to do that day, that week, your life, or it stymies and it weighs you down. And my big message is to inspire people to change their relationship with fear, because it's always going to be there.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. That he projected extreme confidence, and people around him picked up the confidence, but they often didn't see the fear underneath. And one of the big moments in his life is his big breakthrough was when a producer saw him give a kung fu demonstration and cast him as Kato in the Green Hornet. And everybody knows, Bruce knows the story, but it gets canceled after a year. And basically after that, he's an unemployed Asian actor with one credit in Hollywood to his name, and no one will hire him. And he goes a year and he gets like a tiny little bit part on this series or that TV show, and he can't get anything going. And he decides he's going to launch his own martial arts movie project, The Silent Flute. And he tries to get Steve McQueen to join him on the project. And Steve's like, look, I'm the biggest star in the world.
Right.
You're an Asian guy who has one credit to his name. I'm not going to carry you on this project. And so right at this point, Bruce goes and buys a house in Bel Air that's too expensive for him. I think we've all made that mistake before, where we buy something that's just a little outside our price range. And his career is kind of rocky. He's only making a living because he's teaching celebrities kung fu or jeet kune do for $150 an hour, which is like $800 an hour now. And his wife gets pregnant, and he goes to his friends and he says, I'm finally afraid. I don't know. I can take care of myself, but I'm worried about money because I don't know what I'll do if I can't support my family. And that moment to me really sort of captures what it must have been like, that, he's telling himself over and over again, I can make it, I can do it, I have it. But underneath there's this terror that he can't. And even some of his best friends like Sterling Silliphant said, Bruce, you're an Asian guy in a white man's world. You're never going to be a movie star. I mean, you're going to get parts. We'll give you parts. We love you. We think you're talented, but you're never going to be Steve McQueen. This is Hollywood in the 1960s. Like, there are no Asian actors who are stars.
Right. Wow. That's heavy, and I think it's also in many ways metaphoric for all our lives. I mean, anyone who has a dream, you always have people, probably in your first book, like, what are you going to be, an author? Like, oh,
Yeah.
like that's what you went to school for.
Right.
Right. And even your own self-doubt, even,
Yeah.
even 7 years into this book, 6 years into it, like it might've been different for you because you'd already published 2 books. So you knew what the struggle was, but I kind of like drifted off while you're talking that because, you know, I I still every month go, what do I do in life? What's my job? Can I take care of my family? And, here I am, 58 years old, working harder than I ever had, and I think the people that self actualize, the people that really go for it, uh, have that mindset. And I've met some people that I really think don't have fear in that sense, and I'm totally envious of them. But they also they're anomalies. They're not. They're
Right.
they're the weird outliers. Where I'm going, wow. But they're also in many cases they're living a completely different lifestyle. Almost that solo, like Bruce said, I can take care of myself, but I've got these other responsibilities.
Yeah.
Crazy. Um, let's talk about you and some of your. Are you still training a lot? You're still deeply into martial arts?
I still train, not as much as I did when I was younger. So I consider myself sort of a semi-retired fighter.
Nice.
Uh, so I go in and bang the bags, but I don't spar anymore.
Right.
I decided at a certain point I only had so many brain cells left. I should protect the few that are there.
Right. But there's all this new research on neuroplasticity, so you should
Uh-huh.
we can regrow shit apparently. But and how many years did you study? And you'd mentioned you'd done MMA, and you mentioned Randy Couture and George St. Pierre, both of whom I've known. Randy for years, great guy. And George, I knew George before he was Rush. He's from from Montreal.
Yeah.
And at the did you go see him at TriStar, or did you see him in New York?
No, I saw him in New York. John Donaher,
Yeah.
who is his jujitsu guy, was my sort of personal instructor for a couple years, and also his I'm going to blank on the name, but his Muay Thai instructor in New York City. I worked with, and that's where I saw George a couple times. I didn't
Right.
train with him.
Right.
George St. Pierre is way too good for me to train with.
Right.
And then I spent about 6 months at Couture, Extreme Couture in Vegas.
Right.
And Ryan Couture, Randy's son, was
Yeah.
my training partner as he was moving up, and he's like 145 pounds soaking wet, and he just knocked the
Right.
I'm 210. He just knocked the tar out of me. And so that's when I knew that I should stick to writing.
Right.
That I
Right.
wasn't going to make a career as a fighter.
And it's interesting because a lot of people uh watch fights and they have no clue. Just if I mean, these guys are gladiators, and the type of impact and force they develop just from doing this day in, day out. Even if you say, hey, go light to them, their light is, and it's weird because I look at, I look at videos of when I grew up, like there was no MMA, right? As we understand it today.
Yep.
And now there's such a juxtaposition between when you watch MMA and you watch, let's say, Taekwondo tournament, or you watch like a black belt demo, or there are huge discrepancies in efficacy and efficiency, and it's interesting. Are you a fan of mixed martial art?
I am, yeah. I think it's very impressive. And I think the efficacy, what I like about it is, for a long time, there wasn't an opportunity to test out a lot of theories.
Right.
And the octagon essentially to me is like a petri dish. And when you watch the early UFCs, you can see that none of these guys knew what they were doing.
Right.
And over time, through trial and error, a new sort of style was formed. And I think it's interesting that Bruce just in his own brain was able to come up with many of the sort of things that have now proven out through the UFC. I think the disadvantage to it, because I also trained for a long time in traditional martial arts, is that the Eastern martial arts at their best had a spiritual aspect to them.
Right.
And coming out of the Shaolin Temple tradition. And that's something Bruce Lee was very into as well. And, you know, spending time around the UFC guys, they're just athletes. Like they're very well-trained athletes, but it's all winning and losing and getting money and getting paid. And it's all on this very kind of materialistic level, which there's nothing wrong with, but you do miss some of the deeper aspects of the martial arts when all your only goal is to, like, you know, talk trash and be tough and get in the ring. A lot of the values that are expressed through MMA are, you know, pro athlete values, and I don't think that that's the best representation of the martial arts.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, there's a few, to be fair, there's a few, you know, guys in there that will still bow and demonstrate that. Yeah. George is a great example. And there's a bunch of others, but there is that culture of, we're just fighters and
right.
And it's contagious. It doesn't do good things for a lot of people in the audience.
Yeah.
But you want all your, like every, I mean, the world, you know, I don't want to turn this into a political podcast at all, but we're at a really weird time in the world with respect to respect and you know, politics aside and all that, but it's just a crazy time. And what we want, whether we want heroes to be leaders. We don't want them to be poor role models.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I read probably 30 years ago. You know, I was doing most of my introspection in the 80s, and it was, you know, this idea of self-actualizing, of really like trying to reinvent yourself all the time to be the best version of yourself. And we're good. We lost you. We're back live.
Okay. Yeah, I think the internet just had hiccuped.
Yeah, little IT glitch there. Where did it cut off?
We were talking about being leadership and being self-actualizing.
Right. I said it cut off, and I said something fantastic, but I'm just kidding. I don't remember. We'll just jump in. Is there anything? I try to keep these things between 45 minutes and an hour. That's what people tell me is their window for attention. Anything on Bruce that we didn't talk about that you just feel like this is important to get out there? And obviously, like I said, I think everybody who is somehow connected to me, and I've got, you know, law enforcement, military, firefighter, martial artist, like I'm hoping everyone goes out and buys your book. And that was not the point of, you know, of this to sell a book, but I think that I'm a huge fan of reading good biographies, because, you know, to you know, build off or step off from that serendipitous, the concept of self-actualizing, which is a big fancy word for becoming the best version of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Reading other people's trials and tribulations who still achieved something noteworthy enough that somebody wrote a biography of them, right, is fucking inspiring.
Right. And that's what I think fascinates me about Bruce, is that he was very much into self-actualizing as well. He very explicitly read a lot of the books of that era. But his big goal, what amazed me was he didn't, like, you know, when you watch, I've interviewed Jet Li. Jet Li wants to make good movies. Jackie Chan wants to make popular, successful movies. Bruce Lee set out to make movies that would change people's views. He really injected his own philosophy. And when he was working on Game of Death, that was the goal, is to try to show people his own philosophy and not just make another revenge-driven kung fu movie. Uh, and so what amazes me is guys like you and me, he succeeded as a missionary. Like his goal
Nice.
was to use the medium of movies to introduce Western culture to Chinese philosophy, but also to change people's minds. And I find it sort of remarkable that, you know, along the process of working on this book, I've met so many people for whom watching a Bruce Lee movie changed the course of their life.
Mm.
And you really can't say that about other figures. I mean, James Dean is cool, Steve McQueen is cool, Marilyn Monroe's sexy, but no one changed their life because of them. But because of Bruce Lee, millions and millions of Westerners took up the martial arts. And by doing that, they changed their lives for the better. And that's why I think ultimately he's an important figure, not just for those of us who are in the martial arts, but for everybody to understand that without Bruce Lee, the entire martial arts culture of the United States wouldn't exist. He was the guy who popularized it. He was the missionary who made that difference.
Dude, I just got goosebumps from that and still have them because I know had I not, like you, sat in that theater and watched Enter the Dragon, um, I mean, I might not be doing what I'm doing.
No, probably
And,
not.
and I've always referred to Bruce Lee as a spiritual guide, spiritual teacher, um, because I wanted to read the books that he read and understand those influences and understand what he saw, you know, and it, you know, it inspired me to do what I do. So, you know, and like you said, zillions of other people literally, you know, uh, got off their asses, went into study martial arts, and anybody who went to a legit school became a better person because of that.
That's right.
And not because of the fighting side, because of the culture, the spiritual, the respect, the courtesy, integrity, honor, truth, and all that stuff. So, and also finding out about yourself and indirectly learning a little bit about managing fear.
That's right. And one of the things the Chinese often talked about chirku, or eating bitter, but I think their idea was there's a value to development of human character by putting people in a kind of contained, controlled setting to engage their fear. And
Mm.
that's, I think, the most important thing the martial arts does is it allows particularly young men to have a setting where they can go in, someone's watching, there's rules, it's careful, but they get to engage in combat in a controlled setting. And that, you know, for me, I was trying to overcome, growing up as a bullied kid, the fact that I'd never stood up for myself, that I'd never fought back. That's what I was trying to gain through the martial arts. And having the opportunity to keep experimenting with that in a controlled setting is what allowed me to overcome those fears that I had from childhood.
That's awesome. And then realize that you do have that personal power to, and that's the thing that anyone listening to this is, this isn't about, oh, I got to go do one fight, and get that out of my system. It's about understanding that the power to overcome an obstacle is a mindset. And whether you're going to write a book or ask someone to marry you or quit a shitty job or take up a martial art or whatever, then that's our mantra. That's our maxim, is that fear throttles everything we do in life, from who we talk to who we marry, to how much weight we lift, or to whether or not we defend ourselves. And it's either this weight that stymies you, or you look at it as a fuel and go, that scares me, I should investigate that and move through it. Dude, this was a lot of fun. I could feel like I could talk to you for hours. I will probably hit you up when I finish the book anyhow, and connect with you. And I really look forward to reading it, and I will definitely be posting a review about it online.
Awesome. That's great.
Matt, thank you so much for your time. Good luck with the book, and I'll be in touch.
It was a real pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Okay.